Scheafer, Okore. I wear so many hats. I'm a strategic development advisor. I work with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for the goalkeepers as an advisor. I am one of the inaugural Obama Foundation Africa leaders. I advise international, regional, and local organizations on good governance, on policy, politics, and I am deeply, deeply biased on the angle of gender, and my gender is very feminist. So for those who know, and then thank you for everyone who's here. And I'm hoping that I have enough time to go through everything. I love that the previous speakers have kind of mentioned everything I was about to talk about. So I'm going to just talk about governance. And I think a few things that I will mention on the role of the middle class and who the middle class are. And I think a lot of us in this room are automatically middle class. And without definition or without any clarity, there's nothing to argue about. The fact that you have access to this place, the fact that you have the luxury of time to sit and discuss about Kenya, you're very much middle class. You don't even have to be wealthy. You just have to have the luxury of time, because that's pretty much what it is. Because the rest of the country, you don't have that luxury of discussing the country. They're constantly going through it, so there's no time. They can't take a break. And if you belong to a class of people who can temporarily seek refuge, safety, security, escape from everything that is happening that is terrible in this republic, you're automatically middle class. If you can decide and say, I'm just going to take a nap for 6 hours and just forget that this is happening, you are middle class. So having little luxuries and privileges like those are things that we understand. And I think someone like me, I speak from places of privilege and I speak with authority of privilege, because I know my role and I know that I have so much and then there's so much expected. Good governance generally, and on the very basic of things, is what we hope we can have one day, sometime soon. And beyond just what democracy says about being a rule of the people, for the people, and by the people, something that sounds very utopia, it is what good governance is supposed to be. It's where the most vulnerable, and the most vulnerable here are, you start from children, you start from people with disability, you start with the LGBTQI community, we start with people who live in the margins of Nairobi. Those vulnerable people, those people who rarely get services, those people who admire Nairobi because Nairobi is a place where dreams come true, apparently. Those people, if institutions worked, if leadership represented them, then these people would experience good governance. So it is talking about governance from a place of not just institutional and legal and very heavy text, but from a place of feeling. How do you feel about living and waking up in Kenya? And it is heavy for so many people. The causal mechanisms, what exactly should the middle class do? I would start with the one that makes people a bit uncomfortable, and that is be part of the heavy lifting work that is involved in good governance processes, i.e. accountability, budget processes, public forums, public participation, all of those things that are very, very difficult and are always seen as for others and not the middle class. Because remember, middle class, we have time. And it's been defined very well. We have knowledge, we have access to spaces, we have influence, we have power, we have voices, we have platforms, we have networks. So we have systems amongst us that work, that shield us, and those are the systems that we go to when we're seeking refuge, and those are the systems that we go to when we want to switch off. Those are the systems we need to invoke when you're talking about accountability. So accountability in the processes of even devolution cannot work without people who don't do follow-up. And I think the myopia of devolution was the fact that it was supposed to happen in a vacuum, in a context where everything was perfect and leadership was supposed to do what it's supposed to do. And it has failed because of that in very many counties. Not all of them, that's why I say very many. Because there are certain institutions and there are certain tentacles of it that need to work for devolution to be able to deliver what it's supposed to deliver. For example, if institutions on the grassroots are not mobilizing people to tally that with what's happening with national government, if there is no framework, if even the basic thing about communication of public participation forums is not done to reach the majority of the people to access it, and I say this having worked in the grassroots, having worked regionally, and having been in spaces where there's so many gaps around these things, where, for example, in Nairobi, there will be an announcement and it will be on newspapers, it will be on print, and they will say, come on Thursday, we're having a public participation forum on XYZ, something on health, or XYZ, something on a road, XYZ, something on education, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't say venue, it doesn't say time. And if we are keen, we would notice that there's always a gap. So it's always very intentional that these things fail. And the first time we saw that and we raised that question, they said, oh, this was a misprint. We will rectify it. And then a second announcement was made. And they said, come on Thursday at 7 a.m. Still there was no venue. So 7 a.m. where? Under a tree, by the roadside, in a hotel, on a pavement, what's happening? And when you talk about 7 a.m., and it's the very minute things that we should have the eye to watch and question. 7 a.m., you want people to come for public participation forum. Majority of this country don't have the time for 7 a.m. to sit somewhere and discuss these things because they're trying to earn a living. Because remember, that's the time when Yohoka, the guy who sells Safaricom, the scratch cards, is on traffic. The lady who sells mandazis is in the school. The guy who's now selling bananas is doing whatever. So even asking someone like that to be present in these particular conversations is already something that is unjust. So questioning what systems and structures are there to ensure that there's successful delivery of devolution, accountability, the budget process, it's a whole year's process. Very few people have access to that process. Very few people have information about that process. Are we sharing this information? Are we devolving knowledge? Pretty much. Because we devolved funds and we saw what happens. We devolve funds before we devolve information. And then there was mega theft. Number two is the middle class should offer themselves for leadership, alternative leadership, and yes, I mean political leadership. Because I think the easiest thing to do is to talk about how we are fixing institutions, but from the periphery. But then the people who have control to power, to resources, to implementing policies that never happen are in political office. So then the question becomes, we keep seeking these good leaders, but the good leaders that we want are never presenting themselves. And then there's the culture also of understanding the context within which Kenya sits in the political framework, where we are not used to leaders who have integrity. So someone who stands on a podium and doesn't abuse the other is not seen as qualified to lead because they're weak. So understanding the role of political culture, understanding that culture has to change, not just for good people to present themselves for leadership, but also for the people to know that they are worthy of being led by good people. That is our role. Good people must present themselves to run for office, and it doesn't matter how many times we fail. We will win eventually, but we have to start from somewhere. We have to start occupying spaces of authority and power and shaping those narratives, and apologetically so, and saying that, great, that is what has happened previously. There's still 40-something million of Kenyans who are qualified and able and can offer themselves. But the idea of politics is dirty is based on the number of dirty people who have been allowed to run offices. The idea of politics is about scammers and schemers and the rapists and the drug lords and the goons and all of that. It's because those are the people who have been allowed to do this. So then what becomes our role? We are the people who have a backbone. We are the people who have the opportunities to shift these narratives. Number three, can the middle class also support people doing the actual work? And by support, I just don't mean money. And of course, yes, money is also great support. I mean with their networks. The exclusionary way within which structures are formed around people who look the same, sound the same, go to the same places, have the same friends, it's not going to save institutions. Because I think we all agree that the problem with Kenya is not just the struggle around the few who are not getting, but the few who control those who get. So then how do we open up our networks? And as someone who's organized and mobilized on the ground, I have seen people in corporate spaces, in private sector, businesses, and just individuals who were able to support the work we were doing on the ground and the work several other young Kenyans were doing on the ground by opening their networks and by saying, hey, you're looking for somebody to train you on this, I know someone, come and talk to them. By offering their time if you don't have money. Because that's also the thing of people thinking that because we are middle class, all people want from us is money. Some people actually don't. I want people who have time to talk to other people and open doors, right? So there is also volunteering of your skills and expertise. If you know how to do something, if you know how to craft something, if you analyze policy, if you can put things in context, can't you do that for the people doing the work on the ground? And lastly, shift narratives because they have access to spaces. And I think this is so important right now in Kenya, now that the country is shifting towards so the alternative piece and building that alternative piece and what that looks like for a few elite and what the rest of the country feel who are struggling with access to employment, to healthcare, to food, and food that's not poisonous, because 3/4 of our food is also very poisonous. So access to quality food, children who cannot even walk on the road alone because our roads are not safe. Adults who don't even have anywhere to cross because our roads don't have walkways or pathways or whatever it is that mixes it, right? So the idea is, how do we shift narratives? Because we have access to spaces. We are the people who are called to speak publicly. We are the people who are called to write columns and to write blogs, like you said. We are the people who have Twitter handles that can gain traction. We are the people who have access to the ones who are not implementing the policies. Why are we not shifting the narrative? Lastly, because I don't want to repeat so many of the things that have been said, are the middle class aware that they belong to a certain class and can be of influence? Yes and yes. I think the only thing that holds the middle class back is the idea of thinking that change, and we are talking behavioral change, and now we are talking 5 decades of political culture, leadership culture, institutional plunder, social fathing, all of this. We are talking about doing it in an instant, and we are talking about doing it without consequence, which is the biggest lie. The consequence for change is very high. I have paid it very highly, and I don't think anyone who wants to change anything should claim they do if they're not willing to pay a price. It's very unfortunate that that's where we are as a country, and even as a region, as a continent, maybe even as a world. The consequences of changing anything is very high. So, and it varies. It depends on the position you hold. It depends on who you are. It depends on your gender. It depends on your age sometimes. It depends on your tribe. But the consequences are high. The question is, as opposed to what? Because where we are as a country, aren't you already paying the price without actually having fought anything? Because there's the idea of the middle class being the people who pay the most taxes. Even without VAT, it's deducted from our salary, so we don't have, the leisure saying, I'm going to opt out of this tax situation. So it's happening either way. But then what are the benefits of paying all that money if you don't have access to anything that money pays for, right? So the questions are many. I think the idea of change is continuous, that it's a journey and not a destination. The journey of democracy is the same. And thinking that Kenya will be that country where just by one good leader or 2 or 3 or 4, even 1,000 coming forth, then we change. I think the idea is knowing now that we have to think very categorically around the progress of democracy and how we continue being democratic citizens, and that the role of changing countries, of changing cultures, of changing institutions is not an activist role, it's a human role. It's a citizen's role. So that it doesn't become a Scheafer agenda, or the people in human rights, or the people who are teaching, or the people who are writing blogs. It becomes everybody's agenda. Because when institutions fail, they fail everywhere. Nobody's safe and nobody's protected. Lastly, there was a question about, have the middle class in Kenya made any strides achieving good governance for themselves? And historically, and I love this question because I find it very amusing, historically, have there been moments when middle class have changed anything? Because history, basically when you use the term historically in asking a question, it means something that happened when none of us were alive, and we never experienced it, or we had it through folklore and stories, which is very false. Historically is 2019 Sudan and what they did, and looking back and unpacking what it took to get where they got. And the fact that they started 30 years ago, but are only starting to almost reap the benefits in 2019, and I use those words very carefully, so that we are also not lost in the fact that we assume by just replacing leaders, then that we fix system instantly. that it takes a while, and that process is tedious and hard. And that's why we need to pass the baton with every generation. And that the generation we have now is two types. The one that learned silence to survive, and we understand why historically they had to learn silence to survive. My parents learned silence to survive. My mother couldn't speak. My mother couldn't do what she needed to do because she was a woman in a moment, in a time in the country where patriarchy and politics was violent. So she kept quiet. So then she raised someone, me, who now is seeking a voice and for living because we don't want to survive. And I think that's something that a lot of people are still grappling with, figuring out the current generation, what are they doing? We want to survive. We are tired of survival in ways in which requires us to adjust to dysfunction, to accept things that are happening, that's how things should be. We want to live. Kenya is for the living. And I think when we get to a place where we start understanding the role of democracy in depriving people of full humanization, of full thriving, of full existence in their country, then we start to do things differently. Thank you.